My name is Margaret Hale, and I've been called many things: kind, patient, even fragile, but no one has ever called me dangerous, at least, not to my face. The night it happened, I stood in my living room, lights low, a pot of tea cooling on the table. Outside, the wind scraped tree branches against the window like skeletal fingers. I knew he was coming. I could feel the weight of his greed in the air, heavy and predictable. He thought he'd walk into my home and take what wasn't his. Poor boy had no idea. I'd been waiting for him. The clock ticked in slow, deliberate beats, each one echoing through the stillness of the house. My fingers curled around the porcelain teacup, not for comfort, but for control. The steam had faded, leaving the tea cold, untouched. I wasn't here to enjoy it. The curtains barely swayed, but I caught the faint tremor in the air movement outside. My heartbeat stayed steady. Fear had long since left me. Anticipation, however, was a different creature entirely. He thought I was unaware, that I'd be startled awake, helpless in my own home. But the truth, I'd been awake for weeks, waiting for this exact moment. The faint creak of the porch boards was like music to my ears. He didn't know that every step he took was under my watch, every breath he drew recorded in the silence. I imagined his smug smile, the one he wore when he believed he was clever. He had no idea the locks were already set in my favor, the exits limited, the odds stacked against him. My fingers traced the rim of the teacup slowly. Tonight wasn't just about protecting what was mine. Tonight was about teaching him why some doors should never be opened. The shadows in the hallway stretched and shifted as the front door handle twitched. He didn't knock, why would he? Thieves don't announce themselves. But I'd been generous. I left the door unlocked, just enough to feed his arrogance. The wind carried in the faint scent of rain, but beneath it I could smell him cheap cologne mixed with something sharper, almost metallic. I leaned back into my chair, still and silent, like prey pretending to be vulnerable. Only, I wasn't prey. He was about to step into the snare I had crafted with deliberate, merciless patience. The door eased open, slow enough that he must have thought he was invisible. His silhouette slipped inside, pausing to scan the darkened room. I stayed still, my eyes locked on him, though his hadn't found me yet. He moved with false confidence, his steps careful but untrained. The air between us thickened, my pulse sinking with the rhythm of his intrusion. He thought the darkness was his ally, but I knew every shadow, every blind corner. My lips curved in the faintest smile. If he'd been paying attention, he might have seen it and understood it as his last warning. He edged further into the living room, and for the first time, his gaze landed on me. He froze. Perhaps he expected me to scream, to plead, to beg for my safety. Instead, I sat motionless, my posture relaxed but deliberate. My hands rested on the table, close enough to the teacup to suggest harmlessness, but close enough to something else, something hidden if I chose to reach for it. His eyes flickered with confusion, and that was the first crack in his confidence. He had stepped into my world, and in my world, I was the one who made the rules. I let the silence stretch, savoring the way it unsettled him. The wind outside rose, rattling the windows, but it was his breath that broke the stillness. He shifted, trying to mask his unease, but it was too late. He knew, on some instinctive level, that he'd misjudged me. My voice, when I finally spoke, was low and steady, slicing through the darkness. "You're right on time," I said. His eyes widened, a flicker of realization dawning. What he didn't yet know was that the moment he crossed my threshold, he stopped being the hunter. He'd just become the hunted. I remember the exact tone in his voice that day, light, careless, as if my existence barely registered as more than an obstacle in his little game. I sat in the kitchen, hands folded around my tea, listening through the thin walls. Each laugh, each smug comment burned into me like acid. He wasn't just talking about trinkets. He was talking about my life's work, the things I'd saved, protected, and cherished for decades. It wasn't just theft he was planning. It was a violation of trust. And worse, he believed he could do it without consequence, as if I were blind, deaf, and powerless. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe he was exaggerating for his friend's amusement. But deep down, I knew better. His pattern had been forming for years, asking prying questions about my finances, casually offering to store my valuables, suggesting I let him handle repairs I hadn't asked for. These weren't the actions of a loving servant, they were the calculated steps of someone mapping a target. He saw me as weak, and to him, Weakness was an invitation. I thought of my daughter, her bright smile dimming over the years. She didn't see it, or maybe she chose not to. Love can make you blind, but it can also make you complicit. If she knew, she said nothing. Perhaps she thought I could take care of myself, or perhaps she feared the truth. Either way, I understood then that if I confronted her, it would turn into a battle of loyalties I might lose. So I stayed silent, and in silence, I began to plan. The more I observed him, the clearer his intentions became. He'd linger too long in my study, run his fingers along the locked cabinet, glance at the antique jewelry box on my dresser, as if memorizing its place. He thought he was clever, subtle, invisible, but I'd been watching people my whole life, learning their tells, their shifts in tone, the way greed makes their eyes flicker. I recognized it in him, the way you recognize a shadow at dusk. It was there, undeniable, waiting to swallow the light. It's a strange thing, realizing someone close to you sees you not as family, but as prey. There's a coldness that creeps in, a quiet rage that settles deep and steady. I stopped thinking of him as my daughter's husband and began seeing him for what he was, a predator, circling the wrong woman. I didn't fear him. I didn't even hate him. But I decided something that day. If he came for me, I wouldn't just stop him. I'd make him regret ever trying. That's when I began my quiet work. I started moving things, not hiding them exactly, but placing them where only I knew to look. I made small, deliberate changes to my home, each one a piece of a larger trap. I didn't rush. I didn't speak of it. I let him think he still had the upper hand. After all, a predator only walks into the open when it believes its prey is cornered, and I wanted him to believe that, right up until the moment the trap closed. I moved quietly, never letting a hint of suspicion touch my face when he was around. Every step I took was deliberate. The locked storage unit became my safety vault, holding my real treasures, family heirlooms, important documents, and anything with sentimental or financial worth. I picked the location carefully, somewhere far enough that he'd never think to check, and paid in cash so there'd be no paper trail. Meanwhile, my house became a stage set for his arrogance. The bait wasn't random, it was chosen to tempt him, to make his greed flare. I wanted him to think the jackpot was just within reach. The cameras were my favorite part of the setup. I disguised them so perfectly, they became part of the scenery. A framed photo of my late husband, a decorative vase on the mantel, even a plug and air freshener, each one had an unblinking eye inside. I tested the angles at different times of day, making sure they caught every shadow, every movement. I didn't just want evidence. I wanted clarity. I wanted to see the exact moment his mask slipped. The second greed overtook caution. I knew it was coming. It was only a matter of time. When I reached out to my old friend in law enforcement, I didn't spill everything at once. I fed him the story in breadcrumbs, just enough to spark his interest and keep him invested. He'd known me long enough to trust my instincts, and I could hear the shift in his voice when I hinted at what I was setting up. He didn't just want to help, he wanted to see the trap spring. We discussed timing, logistics, and how to make the consequences stick. This wasn't about catching him in the act. It was about making sure he couldn't slip away afterward. The bait items were carefully selected for psychological impact. The antique watch, it belonged to my father at least. That's what I let him believe. The jewelry box, old enough to seem valuable, but containing costume pieces worth almost nothing. And the stack of envelopes, they were filled with paper receipts, folded just so they felt like cash. Every choice was calculated to make his pulse quicken, his hands itch. I wanted him to see them, to imagine what else I might have hidden, to let his own fantasies pull him deeper into the snare. The hardest part was keeping my composure when he tested the waters. He started lingering longer in my rooms, asking offhand questions about where I kept certain things. I answered with feigned forgetfulness, a little too casually, making him believe I was careless. Inside, I was ice. I counted every glance he gave the bait, every pause near the places I'd left vulnerable. It told me my timing was right. Soon, he'd convince himself I was too trusting, too fragile to protect what I owned. And that would be his undoing. By then, I wasn't thinking about him as family anymore. I was thinking like a hunter. Every movement, every word, was part of a performance designed to lure him in. The cameras were rolling. The bait was in place. My friend was ready to act. All I needed was for him to take the final step. I didn't care if he thought he was clever. I wanted him to feel untouchable, because the higher his arrogance carried him, the harder he'd crash when I pulled the ground out from under his feet. The rain masked every sound, making his steps seem bolder as he crept into my home. From my car, I watched his shadow move through the rooms, his confidence almost laughable. He didn't hesitate, he knew exactly where to go. My living room became his first target. Drawers yanked open, shelves searched. The bait worked flawlessly. I could almost see the thrill in his posture. Every second he stayed inside, the cameras captured his greed in perfect clarity. My pulse stayed steady. This wasn't panic, it was control. I wanted him to believe the storm outside was the only witness to his crime. He didn't just take the bait, he devoured it. The antique watch went first, disappearing into the duffel bag. The jewelry box followed, its lid left slightly open like a trophy he'd admire later. Then his eyes found the stack of envelopes. He picked one up, weighed it in his hand, smirked. That was the moment I'd been waiting for, the crack in his mask, the visible satisfaction of thinking he'd beaten me. I didn't look away. I wanted to remember the exact second his greed sealed his fate. I tightened my grip on the phone, ready to make the call. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against my windshield. But inside my car it was silent except for the faint audio from the cameras. I heard him breathing heavier now, moving faster, the way thieves do when they think they're seconds from escape. My friend in law enforcement had been waiting for my signal, his voice steady when I'd called earlier to prepare him. All I needed to do was say the word. Watching him scoop up the envelopes, I knew it was time. My thumb hovered over the dial pad. I pressed the button. The game was over. The response was immediate. Within minutes, a quiet hum of engines approached, unmarked cars pulling discreetly to the curb. He was still inside, stuffing the last of the bait into his bag, completely unaware the walls were closing in. I stayed where I was, my friend's voice in my ear, updating me with every move his team made. The rain provided perfect cover for their approach, footsteps muffled on the wet pavement. I imagined the look on his face when the knock came or when they skipped knocking entirely. Either way, the end of his little game was moments away. The first sound that cut through the storm was the sudden, sharp command from the doorway. Police. My cameras caught him freezing mid-motion, eyes wide, duffel bag in hand. In that instant, all his confidence drained out of him. The gloves, the bag, the stolen items, every piece of evidence was in plain sight. He didn't resist. There was no point. I watched from down the street, the flashing red and blue lights now reflecting in puddles. My friend didn't need to tell me it was done. I could see it in the way they walked him out, head down, drenched in rain and shame. I didn't rush back immediately. I stayed in my car a few extra minutes, letting the adrenaline ebb. My home was secure, my valuables untouched, and the footage was already backed up in 3 places. When I finally drove up, the street was quiet again, the rain still falling. My friend met me at the door, a small smile playing at his lips. "You really set him up perfectly," he said. I didn't answer. I just stepped inside, glanced at the cameras one more time, and locked the door behind me. The execution had been flawless. The reckoning had only begun. The moment the officers tore open the first envelope, his bravado cracked. His voice, loud seconds ago, faltered into stammering protests. One photograph slid out onto the coffee table, a grainy image of him slipping cash into his pocket at work. Another envelope revealed crisp copies of bank transfers, each pointing to his personal account. The officers exchanged looks, their focus shifting from the alleged burglary to something far bigger. His eyes darted from the papers to me, as if I'd appeared out of thin air. He finally realized this wasn't luck. This was precision. I hadn't caught him by accident, I'd hunted him. The room changed instantly. No one was talking about the jewelry box anymore. The air was thick with something heavier: evidence, consequences, the stench of years-old greed finally unearthed. He tried to explain, his hands trembling, words tripping over each other. Those aren't what they look like," he stammered, but the officers didn't flinch. They recognized the patterns: multiple small thefts designed to go unnoticed. Over time, it wasn't just about today's Bretkin. This was a criminal history neatly packaged in manila envelopes, and he had walked right into the trap with his own hands wide open. Then came the final blow. The mistress, he thought was his secret confidant, had been in on my plan for months. He'd whispered every detail to her: how easy it was to skim from work, how no one suspected him, how he was planning to retire early once he had enough tucked away. Every message, every drunken confession, Every boast was recorded. She handed me his truth, piece by piece, until I had enough to not just expose him, but destroy the illusion he'd built. The look on his face when her name came up was pure, unfiltered panic. The offices began matching the timestamps on the transfers with his work schedule. Every piece aligned perfectly. This wasn't just a bad day for him, it was the unraveling of his entire life. He glanced toward the door as if planning an escape, but there was nowhere to go. Outside, rainwater swirled down the gutters, carrying away the last traces of his imagined control. He wasn't just caught, he was cornered. The cameras, the photos, the bank records, the mistress, everything had been positioned like chess pieces, and now his king had nowhere to move. I stepped inside for the first time since it began, my presence pulling his gaze like a magnet. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the quiet mother-in-law he thought he could outsmart, but as the one who had orchestrated his collapse. "You set me up," he hissed. I didn't deny it. The truth was too obvious now. His face flushed with rage, but it was useless. Every officer in the room had already seen what I'd laid out. This wasn't personal revenge anymore. This was legal annihilation. And I'd made sure it was airtight. As they led him out in cuffs, the evidence bagged and sealed, I felt no rush of triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. This wasn't just about my home or my belongings. It was about pulling the mask off a man who had hidden behind charm and lies for far too long. His world wasn't just crumbling, it was being dismantled, piece by piece, in full view of the law. And I knew this was only the first domino to fall. The rest would come crashing down soon enough, and I'd be there to watch. By the time my daughter stepped through the door, the house felt eerily still. She didn't ask where he was. She could see it in my eyes, in the tense way the air clung to the room. When I told her he was in custody, her face crumpled, but there was no love in her tears. She wept for the years she had given to a man who had only ever seen her as a pawn in his games. I held her, letting her grief run its course, knowing this pain was necessary. Sometimes the truth burns before it heals, and tonight it scorched everything. The headlines arrived the next morning. Local papers splashed his mugshot across the front page under words like domestic theft scandal and long-term embezzlement. Exposed. Neighbors who once waved politely now lingered at their windows, whispering behind curtains. Some said I'd gone too far, that I'd humiliated him beyond repair, but none of them knew the nights I had lain awake, replaying his smirk, his condescending tone, his unspoken assumption that I was too old, too naive, too soft to fight back. They hadn't seen the contempt in his eyes when he thought I wasn't. Looking, the house was mine again, not just physically, but emotionally. My teacup sat on the same table he had once searched for hidden cash, and I drank slowly, savoring the taste of freedom. Every room felt different now, lighter somehow, as though removing him had lifted a weight I hadn't realized was crushing me. The jewelry box, the paintings, the heirlooms, they were safe, but their value wasn't in the gold or gemstones. It was in the fact that they were mine, earned through years of work, sacrifice, and resilience. And no one would mistake me for an easy target again. People talked. They always do. At the market, in the post office, on quiet neighborhood walks, there were whispers about my methods. Some admired me, others judged me, but their opinions slid off me like rain on glass. They hadn't been in my position, forced to watch someone circle like a vulture, waiting for the moment to swoop in. They hadn't felt the silent rage of knowing someone underestimated you so completely they believed they could take what you built without consequence. My actions weren't about cruelty. They were about balance. He tipped the scales, and I simply pushed them back. My daughter changed, too. She stopped apologizing for his behavior. She stopped making excuses for the missed dinners, the strange phone calls, the business trips that never added up. She began to see that love without respect is nothing but a trap. I watched her shed the last pieces of him from her life, like a snake losing its old skin. And in that transformation, I saw something inner strength, the same strength he had tried to chip away in me, only to discover too late that I was unbreakable. She would be unbreakable now. In the quiet that followed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It's not fireworks or applause. It's the calm after a storm, the knowledge that you refused to be prey. I didn't seek revenge for the thrill. I sought it for survival, for dignity, for the right to stand in my own home without fear of someone trying to take it from me. And as I closed the blinds that evening, tea in hand, I knew one thing for certain: underestimate me once, and you'll never get the chance to do it again. Some thieves leave with money or trinkets. Others walk away with something far more damaging: your sense of self-worth. He wanted both, as though stripping me bare of my possessions would somehow strip me of my identity. But he miscalculated. I didn't just reclaim what was mine. I made sure he understood the cost of underestimating me. Regret became his shadow, following him through courtrooms, job interviews, and sleepless nights. That's the thing about crossing someone who refuses to stay quiet. You don't just lose the game, you carry the loss with you, etched deep into the parts of yourself you can't repair. I've heard people say that revenge is for the reckless, for those driven by emotion instead of reason. But the truth is, real revenge is methodical. It's patience disguised as inaction. It's gathering every piece of evidence, every calculated move, until the trap closes with precision. I didn't lash out in a moment of anger. I waited, watched, and struck when his arrogance blinded him completely. And in that moment, I proved something to him, and to myself: strength doesn't come from youth. It comes from refusing to be broken. There's a dangerous comfort in being underestimated. It allows you to work in silence, to let them think they've already won. He thought age had softened me, that my battles were long behind me. But I've fought too many storms to be afraid of one more. The years don't dull a fighter's instincts, they sharpen them. I've learned to strike where it hurts most, not just in the wallet, but in the pride. And from men like him, pride is the only thing they truly value. That's why it was the first thing I shattered. They say the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing to lose. I disagree. The most dangerous person is the one who has already lost everything once and refuses to let it happen again. I've stood on that edge before, staring into the hollow space where my life used to be. I've clawed my way back from that emptiness. So when he tried to take from me, he wasn't facing a victim. He was facing a survivor with a sharpened memory and an unshakable will. And survival, I've learned, is the deadliest weapon of all. People often mistake my calm for weakness, my patience for surrender. But calm is where the planning happens, and patience is where the victory is forged. I don't scream, I don't rage, and I don't chase. I let the truth catch up to them, and it always does. He'll tell himself it was bad luck, that things just didn't go his way. But deep down, he'll know it wasn't Fat, it was me, the woman he thought couldn't fight back, the woman who did, the woman who made sure he'd never forget. And I never stopped fighting, not because I enjoy it, but because life has taught me there will always be another test, another threat, another thief waiting in the shadows. The difference now is that I'm ready before they even take the first step. I know the patterns, the signs, the arrogance that always betrays them. They think age makes you weaker, but it only makes you smarter. And when they finally realize their mistake, it's already too late. That's when I win, not with noise, but with the quiet certainty that I'll always rise again.